the vast majority of life is microbial by magnitudes and magnitudes, many orders of magnitudes, right? When we think about life as we know it, however, again, however you want to define that, but in kind of the set of things that we currently consider as alive, the vast majority of it all plays by this kind of weird asexual modes of reproduction where things reproduce through fission processes. The weird, odd exceptions are the sexually reproducing things like us. We are the tiny minority, right? So what we take as normal and kind of the average way to think about this is really just not how life works at all. We're the weirdos often, you look at the phylogenetic tree, we're this teeny tiny little branch way off there that really doesn't matter.
Gunnar, let's start off by defining concepts. This is Mind Body Solution, and you wrote a really wonderful paper called The Split Body Problem. And as everyone knows, this podcast focuses on the mind-body problem. So I think it's a beautiful topic to discuss. But before we begin, let's start off with a definition of life and reproduction.
Oh, you're starting off with challenging questions here. Okay, well, so defining life goes without saying, notoriously difficult. There's not a satisfactory definition yet. There are kind of all sorts of ways that you can do it. Probably some of the most helpful candidates right now would be like metabolic definitions. However, I actually advocate for elsewhere, not in this particular project or this particular paper, but elsewhere, I'm an advocate for actually getting rid of the kind of binary life, non-life division. That I think that's kind of a conceptual vestige, if you want to call it that, that we actually need to start dispensing with, that actually the more it's been explored, what you see going on in astrobiology and what you see happening in physics, it's really, it just is not a useful concept to be deploying anymore. I think we need more nuanced frameworks that maybe the Venn diagram overlaps very consistently in a lot of areas, but not enough to merit the life concept any longer. That, to say the least, is a very controversial position to take, but that is the one that I take. That having all been said, I think that, very broadly speaking, it is not particularly challenging to kind of pick out generally what you want to say is in the life category and what's not. Okay, then reproduction. Reproduction, similarly, is a thorny thing to try to define, although in the philosophical literature and the philbio literature, there are kind of a couple ways of doing this. Some of the most dominant accounts, or rather, I should say the two most dominant accounts, one comes from Jim Griesemer, and the other one comes from Peter Godfrey Smith, and actually jointly with him, Dan Dennett, I think, actually helped develop the account. And the point of tension between those two accounts has to do with material overlap, but roughly speaking, they defined reproduction or replication. And as far as you can kind of align those two as a process where there has to be development, material overlap. Again, that's the controversial one that Jim Griesemer argues needs to be there. And then some sort of continuity. So lineage formation.
And before we continue with reproduction, I like that you touched on the spectrum of life and this non-binary approach to it, because I was first introduced to your work by Mike Levin, and we've spoken on the podcast a few times. And this is something he's very passionate about, just trying to break away from this concept. I noticed you, Daniel, Mike, Mark Solms have had many chats together. What brought all of this about? What's this journey been like? What's going on?
Well, so Dan McShea and myself, we have a theory of how goal-directed systems work. We call that field theory. And Mike Levin is very interested in agency and goal-directedness. So we've had a few conversations with him. And though I think Mike and Dan and I might differ on a kind of some of the really nuanced details therein, though honestly, we actually haven't kind of really compared notes. In a lot of ways, there's a tremendous amount of overlap from the way Mike Levin thinks about goal-directedness and agency and the way that Dan and I do. So actually, I think at the end of the day, we end up having this kind of graded notion of the concept. Um, it permeates a lot more than what people would typically think it does. So yeah, so there's kind of Levin, Dan, and I. We're all in that corner of things. Hence the discussions we've had. And then with Mark Solms, we ended up having a conversation with him because particularly Dan McShea is interested in kind of how affective profiles and psychology plays into kind of how goal-directed systems work. And a lot of Mark's work kind of sits in that realm too.
I've been fortunate to chat to both of them. Mark's actually from Cape Town as well, so I always love putting that plug in there for him whenever I get the
I figured, I thought, maybe that's how you ran across me, is this conversation I had with Mark. So yeah.
So it's really cool. I think the South African within me is always excited to talk about Mark's work whenever I get the chance. But you guys have had some fascinating conversations, and when I speak to Mike and his passionate curiosity about life, I see that with you and Dan as well. And in your split body problem paper, you start off immediately by addressing the difference and the importance of distinguishing between production and reproduction. And production being something like cutting a piece of paper in half. Let's talk about this and address that problem. What's the difference there, and why is it so important?
Yeah, so the first thing I need to do is say that this is all Jim Griesemer. So this is not my original work. I am taking this all wholesale from him. In fact, I think the photocopy example is actually one of his. So I cannot take credit for any of this. But Jim, he's very methodical and does a really nice job in distinguishing kind of what you want from an account of production as opposed to one of reproduction, which is, obviously critically where we would count biological systems. So you have kind of growth and development, right? But mere production, you just get, so I'll work through the photocopy example. So in the photocopy example, what he's noting is that you might have, you put something in a photocopier, make a copy of it, you say, hey, that's a reproductive process, but unless it's in fact the same sheet of material, he would say that there's no overlap, there's no lineage between the two, because you don't, now, you could push back on that in various ways, but just from a 30,000 foot view, there's no material overlap there. And sorting that out from production, the reason he wants to do that is because, if you take a sheet of paper, cut it in half, you can say there has been material overlap between those two entities. However, they don't go on to develop, hence you need the development criterion. So you can kind of you can point at these cases of mere production where you have material that overlaps between a process, but those processes don't go on to develop. And then you can point at cases where you have development, say like an aspen grove that grows exponentially, but without that sort of splitting process, it's not clear as though you have that lineage formation taking place. Hence the hopefully that gets at the distinction for you.
Yeah, you mentioned Griesemer's work and his criteria. How influential has he been on this field, and what's it done to add to our understanding of reproduction?
Well, so in the field of philosophy, biology, mostly where I'm kind of I'm concerned with things. It's definitely one of the two most dominant accounts. It's been influential in the field. However, I think in the larger kind of world of biology, there's not a lot of notice taken. And I think that's because, unfortunately, the process of reproduction is often treated in the simpliciter, and it's not given as much consideration as it should be given. And actually, in my technical paper on this topic, which is in, I think God, now you're challenging me to remember the names of my papers. I think it's Asexual Organisms, Identity, and Vertical Gene Transfer.
I'll put a link as well.
In that paper, I actually cite a bunch of cases, actually predominantly from microbiology, where I think the way that reproduction is thought about and deployed is kind of confused. When you see microbiologists talking about the process, they'll talk about lineage, so one generation to the next, but then they talk about a parent and a daughter as both daughter cells and not. So there's this deep confusion, right? And so that was actually where the whole project started for me, is I just made this observation that, the typical way we think about generations in macroorganisms just does not easily map onto the micro world.
Yeah, and in the paper at some point you discuss what I labeled as the curious case of fission, and you talk about, let's say, a bacterium like E. coli, and when a single bacterium splits into two, are these two bacteria then best thought of as offspring, siblings, or something else entirely? So that's a pretty, when people think about this, they don't really think about that. And I know as a doctor, even when we did microbiology, you're right. They often talk about it in this parental daughter cell, and there's no real thought behind the philosophy of this. And I think it's pretty insightful when you do break it up into these concepts.
Yeah, I think it's not only insightful in that it kind of challenges, I think, a lot of our macro conceptual frameworks. But the other thing that I always like to push a lot when I give this presentation, or when I've talked about it in the past, is that I think it's also just so absolutely critical to remember that the vast majority of life is microbial. I mean, by magnitudes and magnitudes, many orders of magnitudes, right? So when we think about life as we know it, however you want to define that, but in kind of the set of things that we currently consider as alive, the vast majority of it all plays by this kind of weird asexual modes of reproduction where things reproduce through fission processes. The weird, odd exceptions are the sexually reproducing things like us. We are the tiny minority, right? So what we take as normal and kind of the average way to think about this is really just not how life works at all. We're the weirdos often, you look at the phylogenetic tree, we're this teeny tiny little branch way off there that really doesn't matter. So I also really like to press the importance of understanding how this reproduction happens through fission, through asexual processes. I mean, that's really the way life reproduces, life we know of anyhow.
And so, at some point you mentioned it's a simple comment, but you say something like, there are millions of species of microbes, not microbes, but millions of species. And then that really is something you have to think about, because we can't say the same for us.
Yeah. I mean, I can run through all sorts of statistics. I think you can point at stats like in 1 cubic yard of soil, there are more microorganisms than there are stars in the Milky Way galaxy by several orders of magnitude. So I mean, I'm going off the top of my head here. Don't quote me on that. But I go look at the paper. I cite the stuff correctly there.
People are going to quote that. Trust me.
So I mean, I think it's really key to realize really how crucial this understanding of reproduction is, because it is the way life reproduces.
Yeah, and it's also intriguing because at some point you touch on the fact that, and I think this goes into, well, we'll discuss this later, but it explores individuality and connectedness at some point. This is, even when we think of a human being, and we talk about the fact that we have trillions of cells. Don't quote me on this, but let's say there's 30 trillion human cells. The human body probably has about 39 trillion bacterial cells. So the question then arises, are we bacteria or are we human? How do you see something like this, or a question like this? Of course, those things are made up. I'm not really sure of the actual cell.
No, this is great. And it brings up the holobiome concept and all that sort of stuff. So all sorts of questions in individuality. Here again, what I can mostly point to, or what I'll say before I put my own cards on the table, is there's been a lot of interesting work done by people like Derek Skillings and Maureen O'Malley on these issues. So somebody like Derek has pointed out that on the one hand, this does just kind of seem like an interesting philosophical question, right? And you get to think about, hey, what are we really? But it actually does really have real practical implications in things like medicine. For example, right, if you think the microbial communities that reside within us, in one sense of things, are actually parts of us, that we do form a sort of holobiont, right? How you treat those, how you might prescribe an antibiotic, things like that, may vastly differ than if you think actually we're just kind of these co-travelers, right? That I am myself, and it just so happens that I drag along with me all these other things, but they're not really parts of me. And you can actually look at a lot of evolutionary evidence to kind of try to answer that question. So actually, I think Derek's position, Derek Skillings would say something like, the idea that we are a holobiont might not actually be quite as tenable as you would initially think, because the evolutionary trajectories of all those microbes that follow me around, they're really, man, they're moving around, they're transitory, right? The lineages of those microbes don't necessarily follow the lineage of my parents in the same way. So while I sure share a lot of the same microbial community that, say, my maternal lineage has, and paternal, but more so maternal, boy, me hanging out in my environment for the last 41 years has shifted that up a lot, right? And the lineage of those microbes that you'd find in me now have sure vastly changed from the ones you might find in my mom today. So if you think an evolutionary individual, that is a thing that travels through evolutionary time along a lineage, is the way that you should think about individuality, then, me and my microbial community probably aren't one of those, right?
Mm.
Now, if you think of it differently, right? If you think of individuality as being something where you need functional integration, where I'm dependent on that microbial community, then I think you get a lot more cohesion, right? In that case, yeah, I think that there's a lot more interdependence there's just been fantastic work that I'm sure you followed, and I think is actually getting a lot of attention in kind of pop science currently, on how integrated, right, we are with our microbiome, and how that affects everything from, mental health and what goes on in the brain, and so on and so forth, than anybody had probably ever appreciated. So that physiological or functional integration is another way you might think about an individual, or what I would call a physiological individual, and that seems more cohesive. Mm. So an evolutionary individual, probably not. Physiological individual, yeah, I think you have a good case there.
And I think that's the beauty behind the philosophy of biology, is that the practicality behind it is so significant. There's so much that this will change. I mean, one mere sentence of like saying, okay, if you pot the same plant in a different pot, is it the same plant? I mean, these types of questions really do change the game in terms of how we treat patients, how we see things like cloning, any form of genetic mutation. It's really insightful, but more so practical.
Yeah, I think that that's absolutely true. And I think as far as kind of even the ethical questions that we might ask, so for example, is it problematic to sample the microbiome of indigenous communities around the globe to get sampling for, treatment of different medicines and whatnot? How much ownership do they have? How much, is that their microbiome? How much of that is them that you're really using, right? And if that's true, then, we owe a lot more to those communities than typically I think the research and medical communities might be giving them. So it actually, I think it has a lot of impact in all sorts of disparate areas that you might not initially be thinking about. So yeah, these questions aren't, to me, they're philosophically fascinating, and I think that there's a tremendous amount of epistemic value in thinking about them, But there is a lot of practical import too.
Well, let's stick onto that that concept that we were talking about with plants, and you talk about the devil's ivy, and how does cutting this and replanting the shoot challenge our ideas of reproduction? So would you call the new plant that you pot an offspring, a clone, or another part of the same organism?
Yeah, so this is a kind of great way of getting at the problem that you see in microbes, because obviously it goes up to the more macro stuff too. Basically, I'd argue in anything that reproduces through various modes of asexual reproduction, right? Any plant that basically propagates, whether it's devil's ivy, a strawberry plant out in your garden or whatever. I mean, in the world of botany, this is also ubiquitous, right? I think the question there is, if you go off of a genetic criterion, then you're looking at what, who are the names of these botanists are not Jansen, Daniel Jansen, and a few other botanists in the 70s came up with terminology for this. Genets were what they termed in this way. So something that is genetically a clone, right? It carries the same genes, counts as a sort of individual, but they're basically giving up on the criterion that you need the spatial connectivity for an individual in biology, which, of course, if you apply that to the microbial world, gets totally crazy really quickly. So if you entertain that as an actual real viable possibility, then the types of individuals that you're identifying kind of in the biological world and living world, all of a sudden are, spread over vast kind of ecological areas, and largely don't have this sort of functional integration, this sort of physiological unity that we would typically associate with something like an organism. So it's a very different type of individual than what we normally would want to identify, or I think that biologists typically identify. So I entertain that and basically say, what happens when you start thinking about the world in those terms, and it looks a lot different.
And when you talk about, you mentioned the genets, I think your paper also discusses the ramets. Do you want to also just touch on that before we move on to the next part?
Yeah, absolutely. So a ramet is the kind of the other side of the coin on that Jansen identified there, where that would be the individual dandelion or the individual devil's ivy plant or whatnot, where you would use kind of the spatial connectivity or spatial awareness as the criterion for identifying something. Or that physiological integration.
And when we think about, so this is separation, and we're talking more about separation in general, but then there's also the interconnectedness and something becoming one. So if we look at the case of inosculation, where two separate trees grow into one another, do they become one tree? Well, what's going on here?
Yeah. So of course it goes both ways, right? Fission and fusion. And I think, again, it's easy to discount all the ways in which these fusion processes happen across biology. Some of my favorite examples actually come from, basically squids, which go through these processes all the time. In fact, I think there have been a couple really great papers recently that have identified how, oh boy, I wish I knew the paper and the authors off the top of my head, but just recently there was a species of squid that baffled researchers because they had two of them in a tank, and then they came in the next morning and there was only one, and they wondered what the hell happened here. And what they discovered is that this species of squid can actually unify, which others can. And this links up to what I think is a really important question that undergirds all of this, because typically what I found both in microbial research and in kind of the more macro stuff is that the way you think about functional immortality or bioindefinitency is typically the way that individuals are usually picked out. So cases where you have true symmetry in fission and fusion processes are where you have immortal gene lines or something like that. or germlines.
That's pretty cool. I mean, how do you think that 18th century biologists and the approach that's quite prominent today, even in terms of the way we think, would tackle a question like that or a concept like that regarding this fusion of squid? And how would it differ today with the approach that you guys are coming up with or slowly evolving?
Well, so I think historically there's been a propensity towards identifying spatial connectedness. And I think that that's for obvious reasons, not because it was a mistake or a special bias. I mean, just when you think about the history of all this, right? If you didn't have a microscope, it's going to point you in certain directions, right? So as we have more tools at our disposal and you learn more things, you get to see the world from new vantage points, and new stuff becomes available to you. But yeah, the privileging of spatial connectivity is kind of what I suggest we need to stop doing, even though it's easy to do that. But what I will quickly note here is that on the one hand, like the concept of a genet is deeply informative. It's revolutionary in all sorts of ways. I think it's a brilliant bit of work that comes out of botany that has not gotten enough attention. However, it doesn't entirely solve the problem, right? So if genets are things and they are biologically real entities that we ought to be paying more attention to, it's not entirely clear how they reproduce, because there it looks like the growth and development of a genet is the reproduction of a ramet. So how do these genets then reproduce, or do they? Presumably they would have to, otherwise, where did they come from, right? You can look at modes of like persistent selection. That might be one way of thinking about it, but it seems like the new criteria you would have to think about reproduction is in difference of, say, genetic material or traits or things like that, which again kind of goes back to this morphological spatial criterion of identifying individuals, which I'm a little dicey about for all of these. It's embroiled history.
I've scheduled a conversation between Terence Deacon and Michael Evans, so it's going to happen in about maybe a month or two.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, so I'm really looking forward to these two chatting about morphodynamics, thermodynamics, and then teleodynamics, because this is also something you are very much familiar with and focus on quite a bit. What are your views on both of these thinkers and their possible differences? If you don't mind me asking, it's going to happen soon.
Not at all. So I love Deacon's work. He is absolutely fantastic. His teleodynamics and some of the thinking that he's applied to teleological systems, I think, besides, of course, Dan's and my own work, which obviously I think is the right account. I very much like he's a brilliant guy. He and the philosopher that he also has co-authored a lot of this stuff with, whose name is not going to come to me off the top of my head, but they're both fantastic. And I really like their work. However, how might a conversation between him and Mike play out? Well, I can't speculate on that, other than to say I will definitely watch that episode when you have it. So let me know.
I'll send you the link for sure. Do you think they disagree more than agree, or do you think it's going to be a very constructive conversation? I believe it would be.
I think it'll be very constructive. I do think, from my perspective, I probably end up more on the side of Mike, mostly because I've thought more about Terence's stuff, and I do think that there are, there's some points of disagreement between Dan, myself, and I think how Terence thinks about these things. We're kind of rabid externalists, I guess, in a certain way.
I think let's go into that and discuss this. You guys introduced a fascinating idea of field theory and discuss this what would I say, middle ground between teleology and mechanism. Do you want to go into that, and let's maybe head into a slightly different direction?
Well, I think you're going to chat with Dan tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
McShea. You should save that for Dan. It's I've helped him develop the theory a lot, and I have my own kind of ways in which I think it's particularly important, and he has his own. But I want to give him the opportunity. It really is he's the originator of it from a paper he wrote back in 2012. So save that one for Dan.
What I'll do is I'll save it. But before we move away from that, what brought you guys together, and how did this journey of working together in such detail, because there's a lot of papers of you guys working together. What inspired this, and what motivates you guys to continue to work together?
Well, Dan hired me as a postdoc. So just kind of on a very practical level, that's how we started. But, and again, you'll have to actually ask him. But my understanding from Dan of why he hired me was because in my philosophical background, I thought a lot about Aristotle, Plato, and so hence the origins of teleology. And Dan is by training a paleobiologist. So he would, if you talk to him, he'll say he's not a philosopher, even though he's very accomplished in a lot of philosophical journals. I think he hasn't had a lot of formal philosophical training. So he wanted to bring somebody in that actually knew a bit more about the history of these concepts and kind of how they've been deployed throughout philosophical and scientific thought. And I have a background in that, but I also do enough and did enough phil bio that, we also kind of spoke the same language. So he asked if I had anything to say about this theory that he'd worked on that might be historically informed. And yeah, we ended up writing a paper together, and then we worked well together, and we see eye to eye on a lot of stuff. So we've continued to work on a lot of projects together.
Well, tomorrow when I speak to him, any question for Dan that you'd like me to ask?
I'd say a good question for Dan, or what I always press him on, is Dan's very interested in psychology and the makeup of how kind of affect proceeds, rationality or logic. So I always like to press him on that a little bit. We have this kind of a little bit of an ongoing debate because, again, I'm a philosopher by training. So while I'm very sympathetic to the research that comes out of the psychological world, that, we are driven by affect, and that is the source of motivation in human behavior and otherwise. At the end of the day, I also say, well, if you don't have any logical rules governing anything, then you really can't even start doing any work at all, Dan. So I say, I can derive certain axiomatic truths that maybe are not driven by affect, something like it can't be both raining and not raining at the same time, right? I can say that, can't I? So that's a conversation we've had more than once.
You mentioned a few things there that I think we should touch on. In terms of full bio, and you think about the philosophy of biology, it's almost inescapable to then slowly touch on the psychological aspect, because biological beings, at some point, it seems, result in this psychological phenomena. How much thought have you given to the mind-body problem?
Well, being a philosopher by training, I've been steeped in it since I think my first undergrad class in phil bio. So yeah, I have positions on all of that, though it's not strictly speaking where much of my research ends up. But in short, yeah, I mean, for me, having spent enough time swimming in the world of biology, I'm very much in the non-reductive materialist camp on this stuff. I very much think that if you ultimately, most explanations in psychological, social, political phenomena, ultimately you're going to have to ground them somewhere in the biological world. That it's all biology when you really look at it, right? So in other words, I'm not very sympathetic to kind of dualist positions, and I think quite frequently I actually tend to be on the same page as people like Mike Levin or folks like neuroscientists like McFadden, and I think that unfortunately they just tend to have a lot of confusion as to what actually counts as dualism. So I want to point out to them that actually I think they're just these non-reductive materialists running around saying they're dualists and they're just confused.
I just had a McFadden on the show. You're talking about John Joe, right? Just to make sure.
Yeah.
Okay, just making sure. Yeah, I had him do a lecture for me. I think it was 2 or 3 days ago, and he obviously.
Fantastic! Look at that. I had no idea. I should go look at that.
And yeah, no. So I haven't yet posted it, but he's doing two. One was on Occam's razor and just trying to understand and simplify this universe as much as possible, and the other one is on his semi-field theory, which is very fascinating when you really break it down at its core. He describes it as a materialist but not physicalist approach. Sorry, it's either the reverse.
I think the reverse, right?
Or reverse. Well, physicalist but not materialist approach. Yeah.
I think. Yeah, and so that's where I'm quick to chime in, right, and say that actually, the going fashion in philosophy is actually to get rid of this term materialism and substitute it with physicalism for this very reason, right? That it's very hard to point at the material that makes up an electromagnetic field, yet, right, in our physical theories, it's definitely something that we think is real and probably undergirds the majority of reality. So let's call these physical things, maybe not material, though, right? So, yeah.
The mind-body problem is obviously the main topic of this show because it's called a mind-body solution. So I can't not ask you, what is consciousness?
That's easy softballs. Well, so I guess, so I'm sympathetic. I actually think that somebody like McFadden's approach to this problem is the right approach. I think too often what you see in neuroscience and areas like that is a focus on really localized areas, and which is not to say that that can't yield really important things, but I like this identification of kind of more global phenomena that is interactive. So I think a lot of the research that somebody like McFadden's doing and kind of pointing at these big global phenomena that are happening in the brain in neurological processes is absolutely the empirical direction that we ought to be going to try to solve the problem of what consciousness is. But I mean, I like Salm's position on some of this stuff. I kind of like the idea that this is I feel bad with the title of your podcast here, but I think it's almost a pseudo problem, and that we're bringing along a lot of this baggage, right? That Descartes saddled us with, and we just have.
There is no dichotomy. Back. Yeah, there's no dichotomy. Yeah, that's fine. Don't worry. You're not insulting me. I had to come up with some sort of a name so it's okay.
Okay, good.
But I get that a lot where in the comment sections and just in general where people do that to me, where they're like, first of all, this podcast is premised on a false problem. And I'm like, there's nothing I can do. It's too late now. It's out there. I have to continue and just still explore this.
It's catchy, it's provocative, and that's what you need. So that's good for it.
I figured when I first started, I often started the podcast by saying this is just an attempt to get closer to the mind-body solution. So it's not really me giving you the solution. It's rather me venturing out into this problem.
Very good.
At what age, Gunnar, did you feel that, look, philosophy of biology is what I want to do for the rest of my life, and this is something I'm very, very passionate about?
Oh God, I've had a lot of twists and turns. So I started undergrad late. I was convinced I was going to be a climbing bum. I happened to take a philosophy class first year in college. It was an ancient philosophy. I was hooked. I was obsessed. Did the rest of my degree, basically taken as much philosophy as I could, mostly focused on ancient. Then I walked away from it. I ran a nonprofit domestication project in Alaska for about 6 years. That project, I ran into a lot of biology in doing it. Also ran into kind of all sorts of interesting conundrums, kind of on ethical fronts that you might think would happen with a domestication project. And I ended up going back to pursue a PhD for a whole variety of reasons in philosophy. Thought I was going to do it in ancient, but as I started probing kind of Aristotelian ways of thinking about virtue ethics and stuff like that, it got me thinking about human nature, which got me looking at some of the biology behind that, which got me thinking about what a species is, and then, the next thing I know, I surface and I'm in biology departments, and, so the rest is history. So one way of saying it is I'm still just trying to figure out whether or not virtue ethics is a thing, and I just haven't been able to come back up for air, and now I think mostly about microbes.
When it comes to ancient philosophy, who are some of the greats that you admire, and who do you think, in terms of a philosophical history of life, have played the biggest roles in the biology and the philosophy of biology? Sorry.
Historically,
or even in philosophy in general. So let's broaden that a bit.
Oh God. Well, I mean, I've read a lot of Aristotle, so I'm biased. I think it's easy to forget that more than half of all of Aristotle's work was in biology. This is a guy that was dissecting stuff in, 300-ish BC on the coast of Turkey, right? He was trying to explore what bioluminescence was. He was counting the teeth of stuff he was finding in tide pools. This was a guy who went against his teacher Plato and said, "No, I can systematize, life on Earth. You think you think that's not possible? There's no way of actually coming up with any way of categorizing all this. You think maybe we can pull it off in the stars, but the rest of it, screw it." He created a system of logic to do all of that. So I think the very notion of a species in a category comes out of Aristotle. You cannot. It is hard to overappreciate the importance that has had on the subsequent history, right? Yeah. Therein, I think somebody that's very much underappreciated and gets almost no footnote in all this is, in the ancient world at least, is Theophrastus, who was Aristotle's student. Theophrastus actually was the first real botanist who tried to systematize a lot of plant life, which people really are prone to forgetting. He was also a deep critic of Aristotle's. He pointed out how a lot of Aristotle's teleological theories just did not work out, and how everything probably couldn't be purposeful in the way that Aristotle wanted it to be. So Theophrastus is very much underappreciated in all of this. God, as for the rest, there are just too many historical figures to kind of to really point at as to all the twists and turns. One area that, a figure who's obviously well known, but again, who I think can't be overappreciated, and Dan McShea and I are very much in agreement on this, is David Hume. I think there are all sorts of important ways Hume really revolutionized ways of thinking about things that do have a deep impact, I would argue, in biology, even though, strictly speaking, he never wrote on the topic. So Hume, riddle of induction, classic stuff like that, but he did, all this fascinating stuff on, in all these disparate areas, like he gave the first articulation of the puzzle of imaginative resistance, which is, in the current philosophic literature, this puzzle that nobody knows what to do with. So there are all sorts of, just fascinating things going on in here.
Mm. I was speaking to Raymond Noble and Dennis Noble recently, and they were going hard at Richard Dawkins's selfish gene, and his previous title, he was meant to call it the immortal gene, and I think that his publishers changed that. When you think about biologists and their work in the field, who are some of those names that come into your mind when you're thinking about people who, in terms of genetics, life, and biology?
Oh gosh, Evelyn Fox Keeler. Some of her stuff is just absolutely fantastic. I think the way that she's kind of gotten rid of the nature nurture problem. I mean, that's really amazing stuff that every biology student should be reading and be informed about. I mean, of course, there are these looming figures like Dawkins that have just been so transformative in kind of getting the pendulum to swing back and forth in all of these ways that, of course, they're critical to these fields. Currently, people like Mike Levin, of course, are great, and I really like a lot of the work that they're doing. But other figures that have been kind of particular inspirations with me, I'd point to somebody like Lee Van Valen. So Van Valen's work, I think, is absolutely critical in all sorts of ways, and he was just one of these revolutionary thinkers, whether you are thinking about the Red Queen hypothesis or the ecological species concept, or to me, some of the most interesting work that's coming out of Phil Bio right now from people like Ford Doolittle, Pierre Biorat, folks like that. It really has its origins in Lee Van Valen's thought. So the idea that selective processes are applied to a much wider range of phenomena than what you would typically think about. So Lee Van Valen said in a paper in, I think, 1989 that, selective processes happen to granite and feldspar, that you can apply selection to those. And so you'd say, but wait, Dick Lewontin's recipe for how natural selection works, right? It's missing the crucial ingredient of reproduction. Lee Van Valen goes, yeah, but you have persistent selection taking place at all these levels. And that cracking that door open has now just ushered in this whole new realm to kind of the scope of applicability of where we can find selective processes happening. So you can look at recent work by people like Mike Wong and Bob Hazen and how they're thinking about this, the origins of star formation and stuff like that. So it's really cool stuff, really cutting edge, and really you trace it back, and it's Lee Van Valen that first started thinking these ways.
When you're touching on the fact that this field is dynamically evolving over time, and as we're coming into this new phase of artificial intelligence becoming so prominent as a thought process, and now it's just absorbed everybody's lives, in this non-binary approach of life and how you view it, how does one then apply this to artificial intelligence and silicone robots? To some point, would you consider these to be a form of life?
Well, again, here's where I push back a bit and say, so if I dispense with the life concept for a moment and I ask, look, are these, and again, I say here, being the non-reductive materialist, really non-reductive physicalist that I am, I say, okay, most of the stuff that we found has to be carbon-based so far. Whatever, it's going to come in lots of different material forms. So let's stop thinking about that as being some sort of criterion through which to measure these sorts of things. And so I ask myself, hey, can a silicone-based thing be subject to selective processes? Sure. Does it reproduce? Not by our typical standards of what that counts as reproduction. Maybe in certain other ways, but it can sure undergo something like persistent selection. So by that criteria, absolutely. Why not? Okay, does it do other kind of critical things? Does it develop? Again, in kind of typical biological fashion in the way that we see organisms doing this? Yeah, I don't know, maybe not. But it sure does seem to take on new properties and new dynamics that I can treat like traits and talk about their functionality and the ways that we apply those kind of frameworks to biological stuff. So it seems like the toolkit that I have as a biologist to think about these systems, I see no reason why that can't be applied to, say, silicone-based stuff. So, yeah, for me, that's kind of more the question to ask. Biologists have these amazing tools at their disposal. How many of them are going to be applicable to kind of the advances that are being made in these other areas? To me, a lot. Let's start applying those tools and see what happens. What can we discover empirically when we do that? And stop getting all caught up in this, like, is it life, is it not life question? I don't know. I don't. It's kind of a nonsensical question once you push it far enough. All that having been said, I think and again, if you talk to Dan tomorrow, I think one of probably the most interesting things to ask, of course, gets at issues like the Chinese room argument and stuff like that, right? Where you say, okay, at what point do we want to talk about these things as having something like affect or wants as being a motivating driver behind them? And that I think is an interesting question. I don't know what to say about that. I wish I did. You need to talk to somebody much smarter than me.
When you think about from a full bio perspective, and you look at history and you notice, okay, at some point we look at the brain as pumps because we're living in this age where we just figure out mechanics, and then we slowly go into computational aspects of history and we realize, okay, the brain's a computational system, and now we're everything sort of changes over time. And what have been the trends in biology from your perspective on life when you take into account this historical fluctuation? Does that question make any sense?
So are you asking, like, how much do the metaphors that we use at a given historical point inform how we think about bio stuff? Exactly. Okay. Yeah, I think oftentimes metaphors are what we use to scaffold to our next kind of paradigm of thinking about things, and then eventually we outgrow that shell and we need to devise new metaphors. And my guess and my sense is that, we're outgrowing the machine metaphor. We're leaving that behind for a whole variety of reasons. And we're taking on this new metaphor. And yeah, what I would always say, we ought to be cautious about is keeping in the back of our minds, these are metaphors, right? That really it's a way of modeling a system, and it has all sorts of explanatory advantages, but it comes with a whole bunch of disadvantages too. When we created the first map of the world, it was great. It allowed, Magellan figured out how to get from one point to the other. You could do all sorts of stuff. It's an awesome model. It's an awesome tool. It helped us circumnavigate the globe. It also distorts things, right? It gives you the impression that there's an easternmost point and a westernmost point, which of course the globe doesn't have, but a map would lead you to believe it has. And we talk about the westernmost point in the world, and you go, but there isn't one. It makes no sense, right? So I think very much in a similar way, when we apply these metaphors, whether it's algorithmic or computational or what have you, to life, it's a way of modeling or thinking about it. Has all sorts of explanatory advantages, which we should reap, but it's also key to be aware of the explanatory deficits that it introduces too. And I'm sure that there's a whole host of explanatory deficits being introduced here too, where the analogy falls apart.
What do you think is the most probing question right now in the philosophy of biology?
And actually, I think, and again, I mean, the individuality question to me is probably one of the more interesting ones, alongside the directedness question. The individuality question, I think, is really interesting, and I'll be the first to say that I don't think I've done anything particularly amazing or original here, other than point out things that are becoming obvious in new ways, but there's a lot of really interesting work that's going on here. And I think it's deeply important for a variety of reasons, because how we taxonomize the biological world ultimately depends on how we think about things this way. And it's going to have an impact in so many absolutely critical areas. As I say, everything from our ethical frameworks to how we do science, right? If there are just individuals out there that have been off our radar that we're not even studying empirically, my God, what a mistake that is, right? And then similarly, hey, ethical frameworks are all about, what falls within the scope of our moral consideration. And you know what? If you divide those lines differently, it'll end up rejiggering how we think about or how we assign moral weights across the world. So yeah, I think the biological individuality question is a really important one.
At some point in the end of your paper, towards the end, you end off on a slightly provocative note. The paper ends on whether you think about an organism as an object in space or in time might change where you see its boundaries. How do you think this shift in perspective could reshape how we understand or define life and its processes?
I suppose what I'm hinting at there is that I think you can probably think about at least the stuff that's typically kind of considered under the life umbrella in two ways, right? I can think about entities as lineages that exist throughout time. And if it's one of those type of entities, then it's probably been responding much more to the persistence conditions or the fitness conditions of persistence rather than those of reproduction. So I like to kind of frame this in this, and I know we're running out of time here, but Aristotle kind of comes up right with this little mystery, right? He says, look, everything's trying to continue itself in some form or other. You can do that in two ways. You can try to be Alexander the Great or something like that, right? And you can try to be such an individual that just nobody could possibly replicate you. There's only one you ever. You're so individuated. Or you can be a blade of grass and you can just replicate as many times as you want, and your form is maintained itself that way. And I see that as really being the two ways of pulling apart fitness, right? You can do the reproductive thing, you can do the persistence thing. And you see different types of entities, biological entities emerge depending on which one of those that you focus on. So if you focus on the one, you end up focusing in on historical lineages. If you focus in on the other, you end up finding these spatial boundaries. Yeah. Hopefully that makes sense.
I appreciate that. I know we're running out of time, but I think the one thing that's pretty clear from this paper and that's evident is trying to move away from this human-centric obsession of our perspective of what life is and tying it too closely to what we are. And that's often what we've always done. The Ian Vitale, whether we think consciousness is just unique to us, life is unique to us, it seems to be a theme throughout history, and we just cannot eradicate this. It's a strange thing. We are not apart from this universe. We are a part of this universe, and I think that message is painted clearly in your papers and in your work.
Hey, thank you. I really appreciate that. That is definitely one thing I try to push towards, and I think that the study of biology is most helpful in getting us to step slightly outside our very human-centric perspective. So, yeah.
Gunnar, I had one question for you. I forgot to ask you, but today while at work, I was trying to teach a patient what a virus was. And it got me really thinking about it. I couldn't really get into the depths of it. What do you think about a virus? Is it alive? Is it life? This is a complete sidetrack before we close. Sorry.
Well, it's funny that you ask, because yeah, this is the exact kind of realm of dispute going back to where we started between Griesemer and Godfrey Smith, where on their different definitions of how replication or reproduction takes place, somebody like Griesemer is going to say it's not really a reproductive process because there's this sort of scaffolding, but then he has this kind of way of reworking it. So, you know, when a virus takes parts of a cell and takes them apart to scaffold into another copy of itself, there's no material overlap there, but in taking apart the cell, it takes ownership of that material. So then there's this, so he does a little ad hoc tuning to make it work. Whereas Dennett and PGS are saying there is just information, it's informational transfer, that's sufficient for it to be a replication process. So there's an interesting question in there. My view is it's stuff that's subject to selective processes. Let's apply biological tools to it. Why not, right? Probably not a grouping answer, but it's something.
Gunnar, this has been amazing. Thank you so much. But before we end off, what about the split body problem, these concepts of life, and in general, do you think we haven't touched, or that you'd like to make clear to round this off, or to clarify in any ways?
No, I really appreciate your close read of it. I think you've done a superb job of kind of giving a nice general overview. I think the only thing that I'd add is that one other aspect of the article that I tried to impress into it is just how much we continue to be steeped in the paradigms that were really introduced by Aristotle and Plato, right? That we tend to think, oh, we've moved so far beyond all that. And I go, yeah, we're still kind of essentialists at heart, right? We still have that Aristotelian paradigm that we just don't want to let go of. So that's, I'd say that's the only other piece that was maybe buried in there.
No, it's a wonderful read. And I think I'll put the links to the academic paper and the Eon article as well. It's wonderful. I'm looking forward to Dan's conversation tomorrow. And thank you so much for joining me.
Absolutely. Thanks for the invite. I really appreciate it. And it's been fun.